With pleasure.
You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Tensions between India and China have flared up after Indian troops crossed into Chinese territory to stop what they called a road getting built. And can the Asian giants use their shared membership of the deal to end the stalemate? We're going to ask those questions in a later discussion. And now let's turn to Doklam in Tibet, China, where Chinese troops and a group of Indian soldiers have been at the stalemate for around 20 days. It is the very first time that Indian troops overstepped the mutually recognized boundary line and crossed into the Chinese territory. China urged the Indian side to abide by the boundary convention, respect China's territorial integrity, and immediately withdraw its border troops back to the Indian side of the border.
Defending the sovereignty. Chinese Foreign Ministry on Monday described Indian troops' recent border crossing into Chinese territory as very serious.
The current situation is totally different from previous confrontations between the two countries' border troops, which happened at an undefined China-Indian boundary. Indian border troops overstepped the mutually recognized boundary line and crossed into Chinese territory. This move is a violation of the 1890 Convention, as well as the basic norms of the UN Charter and international laws. The violation is very serious.
The standoff took place on June 16th, when Indian troops approached a Chinese army unit and tried to stop them from building a road in the Doklam area near the Indian state of Sikkim. The Sikkim part of the border was settled in the convention between China and Britain in 1890. The convention has been upheld by previous Indian governments and was reaffirmed by the former Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal.
In a letter to then Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai on March 22, 1959, Nehru said the border of India's protectorate, Sikkim, and China's Tibet was defined by the 1890 Convention and marked by both sides on the ground in 1895. In another letter from Nehru to Zhou on September 26 the same year, Nehru repeated the statement, adding no dispute regarding the border between Sikkim and Tibet. From all the above, India's current move runs counter to its consistent position.
On Tuesday, Chinese ambassador to India, Luo Jiahui, expressed deep concern over the standoff. In an interview with the Press Trust of India, Luo said Indian troops need to unconditionally pull back to their side of the boundary. He stressed that both sides need to seek a peaceful solution to maintain tranquility in the border area. The crossing happened just ahead of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the United States. Some say the move is to show the U.S. that India has the power to contain China. Also last month, India officially joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Bilateral ties between China and India have never been more complicated.
For more discussion about that dispute and border tension in Beijing, we have two panelists joining us here. Yang Xiyu, Senior Research Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Also with us, Professor Wang Yiwei, stay with us from Renmin University. Joining us in New Delhi in India, we have Professor Madham Lalapat, who is Director of the Geopolitics and International Relations Department at Manipur University. Gentlemen, I want to welcome the three of you to our program. First of all, is there a way to resolve what is now a border tension and likely, if go on like this, a crisis? Let's have Professor Nalapat first from the Indian side.
Well, I'd like to point out that the entire border between India and China should be mutually agreed and delineated. And certainly, India would very much like to see this happen. Now, we have had situations in which we have said the Chinese troops have been crossing into Indian territory. In fact, some 300 such incidents take place on average every year. So all this is a consequence of the fact that we don't really have a sharply defined border. And of course, we've been talking about Nehru. Nehru sent many letters to Mr. Zhou Enlai, and in several of those letters, he claimed a large part of territories which are today regarded by China as Chinese territory. So I think, frankly, Nehru sent a lot of letters, and if we had to accept one letter, then it's difficult to understand why another letter is not accepted. My point is very simple. These are two big mature countries. They need to sit down and work out a mutually acceptable border. After all these decades, it's very surprising this has not happened.
Okay. Mr. Yang, you want to respond to your Indian counterpart's view?
Well, I'm afraid I totally disagree with our Indian friends' argument, because the legal documents between countries, especially based on the convention signed by Chinese government and the British government more than 100 years ago, should be the legal base for all the border solution or settlement. While if you say some letter could be legal, some useful, some letters or documents are not useful, that will make the international order norms in chaos, especially in China-Indian disputes on the boundary.
I'm not sure whether all of you, any one of you, have read through all of the letters through both sides. So before we make a statement.
भारत से डरा चीन भारत के सामने घुटने टेकते नजर आ रहा है। तो आइए देखें कैसे भारत ने चीन को सिक्किम में धूल चटाई। आप तो जानते होंगे कि चीन हर बार भारत और दूसरे देशों को अपनी दादागिरी से डराने की कोशिश करता रहा है, लेकिन भारत ने इस बार साफ कर दिया है कि भारत अब 1962 वाला भारत नहीं रहा। भारत ने चीन को सीमावर्ती इलाके में सड़क बनाने से रोकने के लिए ऐसा किया। इससे पहले चीनी सेना ने भारत के 2 बंकर तोड़ दिए, जिसके जवाब में भारतीय सेना ने चीन के 6 बंकर तोड़ दिए और क्षेत्र रक्षा करते हुए भारत ने सिक्किम बॉर्डर पर चीन को पीछे धकेलते हुए चीन के 3 किलोमीटर भूभाग पर कब्जा कर लिया है, जिससे चीन बुरी तरह तिलमिला रहा है। भारत ने ऐसा अपने मित्र देश भूटान की सीमा रक्षा के लिए किया है। भारत के साथ भूटान की रक्षा संधि है। फिलहाल भारत के पंजे में फंसा चीन कीदड़ भपकी देने से बाज नहीं आ रहा, लेकिन भारतीय जनरल बिपिन रावत ने साफ कर दिया है कि भारत चीन को सीमावर्ती इलाके में सड़क बनाने की इजाजत नहीं देगा। जय हिंद।
Okay, let's get to our panel. Joining me now here in the studio is Song Zhang. He is the chief correspondent with the Shanghai Wenhui Daily in Washington, D.C. With me here too is Saurabh Gupta. He is a senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Joining us from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is a Chinese international relations expert. And with us here in the studio as well is Saranand Dume. He is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome to all of you to the show. Saranand, let me start with you. China has accused India of using the protection of Bhutan as an excuse to stage this incursion into Chinese territory. What is India's position on the standoff?
Now, this is viewed very differently in India. Now, broadly speaking, the Indian position kind of comes, it's twofold. The first is that though that this is a disputed territory between Bhutan and China, and not between India and China, India has a very close relationship with Bhutan and has been called in by the Bhutanese to assist. That's the first part. The second is that what Indians see as the flashpoint over here is China changing the status quo by building a road in this disputed territory. If there had been no road in this disputed territory, then the Bhutanese would not have called upon India for assistance. If that had not happened, Indian troops wouldn't be there. Now, the reason this is very strategic for India and why this matters so much is that this is part of a part of the border that is very close to a place called known colloquially as the so-called Chicken's Neck, which is a sort of narrow strip of territory that connects India's northeast to the rest of the country. So the strategic implications of this road being built over there, while negotiations are going on to sort of settle the final status of this, obviously is quite high.
So is the Indian concern that China, by building this road, is putting certain facts on the ground which
Absolutely.
might not be in dispute later?
Exactly. It's putting facts on the ground, and it is changing the military situation on the ground. And it is also, in the Indian view, doing this when, in fact, there is an agreement that on issues of the so-called tri-junction, which affect India, China, and Bhutan, the three countries should come to some agreement.
Okay, let's go to Victor in Beijing. And Victor, this area where China says there was an incursion is called Doklam. China says its sovereignty over this area dates back to a treaty it signed with Britain in 1890. What are China's main concerns right now?
Well, first of all, the Chinese side is very clear about this particular area belonging to China, citing all the way to the 1890 treaty involving China, the then British Indian Empire, and the Kingdom of Sikkim and China's Tibet. And the Indian side originally cited kind of territorial dispute between Sikkim and China, which completely fell apart. Now the Indian side is using the so-called territorial disputes between the Kingdom of Bhutan and China and using that as an excuse to send its troops into this particular area that China claims to be the Chinese territory. Now, if the Indian side really wants to build up this case of sending its troops to the Chinese side of the border, occupying that for many, many days in a row, then the argument on the Indian side is very, very flimsy. Further, if the Chinese build a road in the Chinese side of the territory and the Indian side will claim being threatened by the road building, then I will say China will keep building more roads to the Chinese side of the border, and the Indian side will need to be frightened again and again. If you look at the international situation, a country has the right to build a road within its own territory. Therefore, I think it is time for India to wake up to the reality and to withdraw its troops. The longer it keeps its troops in this particular area, the more likely that this will trigger a confrontation between China and India at a time when neither China nor India can better serve itself or its own people if a military confrontation breaks out in that particular area.
Right, I get your point, Victor, about a country being entitled to build a road or any other thing on its territory, but this, as Sadanan pointed out, is territory that's in dispute.
No, I don't think so. I think from the Chinese perspective, the Kingdom of Bhutan is a sovereign state, has its own independence, and India has no right to treat the Kingdom of Bhutan as a protective state and sending its troops into the Chinese side of the territory by using Bhutan as an excuse. Because if this is the case that India wants to use, then there are many, many areas where war or confrontation may break out. For example, China and Pakistan are building transportation connectivity projects through part of the Pakistani side of Kashmir, which India claims to be Indian. Does this give rise to India to send its troops to the Pakistani-occupied part of Kashmir to disrupt the Chinese-Pakistani efforts to build highways and railways and other connectivity projects over there? No, it doesn't give India any reason or any right to do that, because otherwise the international law will be completely trampled and there will be no peace or stability throughout the world, and war will become the rule of thumb rather than peace and stability and diplomacy.
Saurabh, so we have a standoff right now, growing tensions. China is demanding the immediate withdrawal of these Indian troops. How serious is this?
I think this is fairly serious because the bottom line, as Victor said, is Indian troops have no locus standi to be in that part where they are across the border. So China can unilaterally demand that India unilaterally move troops back without any payment. If there is something to be discussed or negotiated, that is between China and Bhutan, and that happens on a separate track. Right. So at this point of time, China-India relations have been on a downward spiral. So China is the aggrieved party out here. It can stay the aggrieved party out here, and it can demand that India move troops back, or the relationship will deteriorate. They will set a floor, of course, but it will deteriorate. And India doesn't have ground to demand a sort of diplomatic payment in exchange, because, as I said, that is between China and Bhutan to manage by way of some sort of boundary management protocol.
Song, this is a long-running dispute, this border dispute. China, India, and Bhutan have disputed this area. There have been negotiations between China and Bhutan since the 1980s. There have been something like 24 rounds of talks. What is the status of those negotiations right now?
Let me give you one example. I was in Nepal for 9 years, and China and Nepal fixed their border in 1962. And I don't think these border talks between Bhutan and China will have a conclusion anytime soon, because I think, you know, Bhutan is having no diplomatic relationship with China, with America, with Britain, and many other big countries in the world. And so I think as long as Delhi is saying that you need to hold until the border issue between China and India will be solved, you cannot seal the agreement with Chinese side. I think that is the fundamental reason why we have 24 rounds of talks and we cannot fix this border issue.
Saradan, the Indian Foreign Secretary recently called for a de-escalation of tensions in the area. He said differences should not be allowed to become disputes. Is that a hopeful sign that this could be resolved?
I think one of the most striking things about this particular standoff is the difference in tone and rhetoric. What you're seeing emanating from Beijing, both in terms of what you're hearing from the foreign ministry, but also what you're hearing from state-controlled or state-linked media, is a great deal of belligerence and a sort of black and white view of this, that, you know, we are in the right and we've been wronged, and the sort of things that Saurabh was sort of echoing in his comments. I think the view from India has been much more muted, much more mature in my view. They've said, listen, look, there are disputes. We've had disputes before. We will have disputes in the future also. The way to deal with these is to talk them through. The way to deal with this is not to amp up the rhetoric, threaten war on other fronts, and that sort of thing, which is quite unusual and quite striking, because in the past, both countries actually have had a pretty good record of managing these things. So they may not have necessarily come to some kind of conclusion on the disputed border, but this is a border where there hasn't been a shot fired in anger in 40 years. And that proves that both the Chinese and the Indians have managed to sort of deal with some of these delicate disputes with a degree of maturity. And I would hope, and I think that is what the Foreign Secretary of India was sort of suggesting in his comments, that again, a sort of sense of maturity and a sense of the long view, that it makes no sense for these two countries. I agree with Victor there. It makes no sense for these countries to get into a military confrontation. And frankly, it makes no sense from the Chinese perspective to be positioned in the eyes of the Indian public as a hostile country, which has never been the case, even after the 1962 war for most Indians. And I would imagine, though I'm not an expert on how the Chinese view Indians, that there would be an interest also in China not to sort of unnecessarily sort of take this and turn it into something that is larger than it needs to be.
All right, Victor, what is your view on this? Will diplomacy prevail? Is there time right now to lower the temperature?
No, first of all, while I have full respect for the other panelist who just now made his comment, I strongly disagree with the premise of his argument, and I found the premise very much hypocritical. Now, in the world today, if you believe that a foreign country sends its troops into your side of the territory, occupies that for weeks in a row, refuses to withdraw the troops out of your country and back into his own country, and then you call it moderation? No, I think any other country in China's situation would send troops to drive out the Indian invasion troops. I think China has been very tolerant. China does not want to fire the first shot. China has been urging the Indian side to use all its wisdom and courage and vision to withdraw the troops. And the longer India keeps its troops on the Chinese soil, the more India will eventually lose. And I think it may be time for China and other countries to demand that the Kingdom of Bhutan really be treated as an independent country with full right. Why shouldn't Bhutan establish diplomatic relations with the United States, with China? Why should India control the visas that the Kingdom of Bhutan can issue to international tourists? This is unfair treatment of the Kingdom of Bhutan. And what India is doing may be a repetition of the annexation of the former Kingdom of Sikkim. So I think India need to really be a very responsible country, treat Bhutan as an equal, sovereign, fully independent country, rather than mishandling Bhutan as if it is part of India. Bhutan is an independent country with full sovereign right, and India should treat that as it is.
Okay, I want to take a break, but Saranan, I want to give you a chance to quickly respond to that.
Well, I mean, I think that, I think Victor's sort of, rhetoric really points to exactly the point I'm raising. This is, first of all, to frame this in such starkly black and white terms presupposes that this is not a dispute. The fact is that this is disputed territory. This is acknowledged as disputed territory. Now, the Chinese obviously are not going to agree with the Bhutanese claim. That is understandable. But there is a Bhutanese claim. Now, the second point about sort of India-Bhutan relations, the point is well taken, but I think it's for the Bhutanese to decide what the nature of their relationship with India will be. And the Bhutanese have very clearly, in this case, they feel threatened, and they have called upon India. They have made an official statement through their foreign ministry.
Right.
So this idea that, that third countries should sort of should determine what the Bhutanese see as their own interest, I think is simply not true.
Okay, we are going to take a break right now. Much more on the border tensions between China and India when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.